So the floor is yours.
Great, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. This was just so beautiful to have Mary Jo, Byron, Mike. Thank you all. This is home for me in so many ways that it goes beyond the idea of home. Like Byron kind of pointed out, I don't have a home really. So it's just so amazing. These really personal introductions really touch me. I appreciate that very much. And of course, I'm very much honored by all that you guys have said. Specifically, this last bit that Michael said, I just want to put things in perspective. Um, the work that Orchida has done, obviously the work that Byron and Mary Jo have done, Michael have done on Iran, they are really deep works of analysis, research, and so on. But what I'm doing is based mostly on my personal experience, clinical experience, working with and training, teaching experience, which I've been involved with the last few years with Iranians inside and outside the country. Primarily, I'll be focusing on those inside the country in the areas of mental health. So I've been working with a lot of, psychiatry students, residents, psychology, psychoanalytic people in psychoanalytic training, and so on. And this is my observations from those. So, obviously a lot of things have happened. Those of you may remember I talked about, the woman life freedom situation that was unfolding in Iran a few years ago and all that. So I've been very engaged and very involved and, following up my own ethnographic observation. So anyway, just with that in the background, let me start. The title that I've picked for this talk, which was Mental Health in Iran, A Tale of Two Beggars. This Tale of Two Beggars is actually goes back to an Iranian proverb that says, Geda be geda, rahmat Khuda. Now translates from one beggar to another, God's mercy. That's how it translates. So that's an Iranian proverb, typically spoken with a sigh, a shrug, or sometimes as a joke. Um, I you guys don't have my slide, right? Let me share my slides as well. Um, from here. You guys see that?
Yes.
Great. That, by the way, is written by ChatGPT. Both the image and the writing is all done by ChatGPT, which is the writing Gada be Gada Rahmat Khuda in Farsi, in Persian. But anyway, yeah, as a bigger background. So shrug, or sometimes as a joke, meant to capture a condition of mutual lack. One beggar has little to give to the other. All her uh, has all he or she has to offer is the hollow comfort of invoking divine mercy. For me, this proverb also captures something essential about mental health care in Iran today. It captures the paradox of asking one person who is depleted, unsupported, restricted, surveilled, repressed, and uncontained to provide care to another who is just as depleted and frightened. It speaks to the impossibility, or perhaps the frailty, of the mental health encounter when both provider and the patient are in a state of crisis. Let me start with a voice. Um, this is from Atafa. There's a rule. All these names, by the way, of course, are pseudonyms, but there are some that are pulled from the media. Those are real names. It'll be mixed. Uh, There's a rule, unspoken but clear, she says. People like us don't get to fall apart. We're the ones holding it together for others. If I ever said I wasn't okay, I don't know what would happen, not just professionally, but existentially. It would feel like betrayal. So I just work, I teach, I write, I keep my panic out of view. This is the voice of a young psychiatrist I work with who is in Tehran. Um, though I could just as easily be quoting several others. She's expected to hold together the psyche of others while disguising the fact that she herself is on the brink of disintegration. She's a beggar asked to feed another. What I present today is about this impasse, the challenge of cultivating healthy providers and good care in Iran under conditions of structural scarcity, ideological distortion, and political repression. It is about the paradox of being a therapist in a setting where the therapist is as much in need of support as her patient, and where the act of acknowledging the need is itself taboo or even dangerous. As Jenkins, just one moment, sorry guys. I want to make sure I can. All right. As Jenkins reminds us, political subjectivity takes shape at the nexus of orientation and atmosphere. Orientation is about what people turn towards: survival, healing, dignity. Atmosphere is the social and emotional air they breathe. In Iran, that atmosphere is saturated with toxic scarcity, with fear, and with repression. Think of Hashem Khastar. This is Hashem Khastar, um, a teachers' union activist who was forcibly admitted to Ibn Sina Psychiatric Hospital in Mashhad. His orientation toward justice and education collided with an atmosphere of coercion, where dissent is medicalized as illness. Let me tell you a little bit more about Khastar's psychiatric case. One thing I want to mention is just there's so many of these that I had put a lot of cases with details, and then I ended up having to remove all of them simply because there's just no way. It's overwhelming. And so I ended up just addressing as a general idea. Khastar was picked up by plainclothes man without a warrant and admitted against his will directly to the hospital, despite no history of mental illness. He was tied to a bed, injected with drugs, and denied family access. When the case leaked to the media, intelligence services pressured psychiatrists inside and outside the hospital to retroactively certify him as mentally ill. His wife recalled, on the first day, she said, when my husband wanted to use the toilet, guards did not allow it and forced him to defecate in his room. So that's the kind of situation he was kept in. Again, I'm not going to get into details. Even the Iranian Psychiatric Association protested in a letter, albeit under intimidation. As cultural psychiatry and political subjectivity teach us, mental health is not about a set of universal symptoms and diagnoses. It's about practices shaped by things like cultural traditions, family obligations, gender expectations, religious sensibilities, and so on. And at the same time, political life is lived in the most intimate corners of the psyche. In Iran, political subjectivity is woven into daily life, how people speak, what they don't say, and what they dare not feel. For providers, it takes the form of self-surveillance in the clinic, fear of exposure in training, and the sense that even one's inner world is not fully one's own. Janice Jenkins insists that defense mechanisms are not just personal, they are psychopolitical, she says. In Iran, patients minimize the political roots of their suffering to survive. Clinicians reframe distress in quote unquote neutral medical terms for reasons ranging from fear to resistance to genuine concern. But the fact remains that politics and psychopolitical mechanisms are so deeply present in Iranian psi discourse and practices. And of course, this is not to say that repression shapes the clinic and the clinical encounter only indirectly. Repression also structures how both patients and providers defend themselves in their speech and their practices. Roya Zakeri, there's another example, was another political prisoner taken to Razi Psychiatric Hospital in Tabriz. The official explanation was that she required treatment though everyone knew it was a political punishment. The language of psychiatry, here as in many other instances, obscures the violence of repression, or is meant to, used to. The state has systematically used psychiatry as a weapon in recent years, especially in recent years, forcibly transferring prisoners, injecting them with unknown drugs, even subjecting them to ECTs without, obviously, consent. Another one, Bahman Mahjubi, a Gonabadi dervish, was arrested during peaceful demonstrations, and he died after repeated forced hospitalizations and forced medication at Aminabad Hospital. These practices poison the atmosphere of psychiatry as a whole. Fear seeps into wards. Providers are traumatized into silence and compliance, and ordinary patients live in institutions haunted by such events. Here, again, as Jenkins would put it, orientations towards healing or justice collide with the atmosphere of coercion. The problem of mental health in Iran is not cultural incompatibility. Psychoanalysis and depth psychology resonate deeply with Iranian traditions of storytelling, poetry, and interiority. The real obstacles lie in how imported theories are rigidly scripturalized or ideologically hollowed out, and in clinicians left fragmented by training and punishes that punishes by training that punishes vulnerability while demanding containment. This is not just about individual distress, but about a system that places two struggling humans in front of each other, both in states of mutual precarity. Patients arrive with idioms of suffering that both echo and exceed biomedical categories. Of course, here Byron and Mary are know a lot more about this than I would. دلم گرفته, my heart is heavy. اعصاب ندارم, I have no nerves. خسته‌ام از زندگی. I'm tired of life. And نفسم بالا نمیاد. I can't breathe. And so many more. Providers listen with empathy, but often from their own exhaustion, fear, and silence. The clinic thus becomes a space where two beggars meet, not in hope and healing, but in fragile solidarity. And I want to highlight this fragile solidarity in co-endurance and a profusion of shared silences. So today I'll tell you a story of the Iranian mental health using content from people that I've worked with, you know. Okay. By the end of this, I hope to return to this proverb, Geda be Geda, Rahmat Khoda, not as an indication of hopelessness or resignation, as much as a paradoxical recognition of a shared fragility, which can lead to a shared path of resilience and a sense of fragile yet liberatory solidarity. Training as psychic violence. Training in psychiatry in Iran is often described by residents as an initiation into silence. This is not silence as calm or contemplation, but silence as avoidance, denial, and erasure. The deliberate learning not to feel, not to think too much, not to say what should not be said. Here's from Arash, a quote. Sometimes in supervision, I'd just nod and smile, but I had no idea what was being said. I couldn't track anything. I thought I was losing my mind because everybody else seemed to be getting it and nodding, or maybe that's just what the training was doing. It's like they teach you to delete yourself so you can manage other people's reality. You just have to disappear to survive it. This is not just a personal complaint. This is training as psychic violence, a system that demands clinicians erase parts of themselves in order to function. The paradox is clear. Those supposed to contain others' distress are forced to dissociation as a condition of survival. Another psychiatrist told me about dreaming of the ward where she was trained. I started dreaming, she says, about the ward, not metaphorical, literal dreams, the same hallway over and over, she says. Sometimes I was a patient, sometimes a doctor, sometimes I couldn't tell. I'd wake up and still feel like I was there. In Farzana's dreamscape, the boundaries between doctor and patient collapse. The training hospital is not simply a workplace, it enters her sleep. Training here produces not resilience, but haunting. Veena Das has taught us that violence seeps into the ordinary. Training in psychiatry in Iran exemplifies this. Violence woven into education, silence, dissociation, and erasure, these become competencies. And this, of course, has consequences for the clinical encounter. In supervision, dissociation means mimicking comprehension. In the clinic, it means attempting to contain patients' distress by cutting off one's own and theirs. What looks like professional composure is psychic depletion. To be a good resident is not to be reflective or vulnerable, but it is to survive intact, avoid attention, and endure without complaint. And yet, beneath this silence, shame and fear accumulate. One resident says, I almost asked my supervisor for a day off, just one day, because I had been crying all night. But I knew what would happen. Either I'd be marked as unstable or I'd get a pep talk about resilience. So instead, I went in, saw 5 patients, and then cried in the bathroom between sessions. It's a small story, and probably those of you in other countries can imagine situations like that. But it captures the double bind. Ask for help and risk being branded unstable, or withhold and risk collapse. Either way, silence is ensured. A clear case of what Bateson would call the double bind. The irony is stark, though. Psychiatry, the field, and mental health in general, the field meant to treat mental suffering produces unnameable suffering in its own providers. The hospital becomes a place where trainees cry in bathrooms, dissociate in supervision, and dream themselves into their patients' roles. As one clinician put it, we're trained to turn pain into paperwork. When these clinicians later sit across from patients, the encounter is not about surplus meaning lack. It's about lack meaning lack. As Orkideh Behruzan and Michael Fisher have shown, psychiatric vernaculars like depression have become generational idioms in post-revolutionary Iran, collapsing trauma, anxiety, and hopelessness into a single word. Trainees are not outside this vernacular. They live inside it. They too speak depression, even if not aloud in professional settings. For them too, depression functions as what Behruzan and Fisher call a social grammar, a poetics of absence, of repetition, and of being stuck. Depression is not just a symptom here, it is a social grammar, they say, a poetic of absence, of repetition, of being stuck. Providers embody this generational history in their struggles with stigma, censorship, and survival. The discourse is not just something they deploy, it is something they inherit, metabolize, and are haunted by. Suicide rates among residents have risen sharply, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, leading them to form informal support groups online or by phone. And the challenges they're having in just holding those groups is itself a whole story. It is not just long hours, just setting those groups together to talk about suicide. They were given this feedback that this sounds wrong because they have this expression, siyah nemai, you're showing things bleak. By putting groups, why would you need to put groups to provide support for suicide to residents? Anyway, it is not just long hours or poor supervision. Training enforces silence. That's the point. Polices vulnerability and teaches clinicians to erase themselves, not to help others, but to keep a system of power intact. It confuses dissociation with professionalism and equates survival with competence. Depth distorted. While training in psychiatry erodes subjectivity through silence and dissociation, depth oriented training is distorted through the strange double life of theory itself. Depth approaches should, in principle, resonate with Iranian culture, like I said. Iran has long traditions in many related areas, layered metaphoric communication and interiority. Storytelling and associative thinking are already part of the cultural soil. As Gohar Homayunpur recounts in Doing Psychoanalysis in Tehran, when a Western colleague insisted that Iranians, quote, cannot free associate, she replied, and I'd say quite aptly, that Iranians do nothing but free associate. Free association is not a foreign skill in Iran. It is almost a cultural second nature. And yet, this resonance is precisely what is obstructed in training. Instead of being integrated creatively into cultural life, depth psychology is caught between two distortions. On one side, it is scripturalized, it is the scripturalization of important models. Freud, even Lacan, especially Lacan, are treated like sacred texts. Students learn to repeat interpretations word for word rather than adapting them to local contexts. And deviation becomes heresy. I once offered a different reading of a patient's dream, one of them says, Afsana, drawing on Hafez. My supervisor stopped me. That's not psychoanalysis. That's Sufism. Does this institution look like a tavern to you? I felt like I had sinned against theory itself. From then on, I was careful not to mix things up. This is a psychologist. Scripturalization transforms psychoanalysis from free thinking into role repetition. Instead of cultivating creativity, it enforces conformity. What could have been fertile cross pollination, weaving Freud and Hafez, Lacan and Rumi, becomes intellectual policing. On the other side is the project of Islamization or nativization, Bumi Sazi, as they call it. Psychology and other social sciences must be purified to align with religious and political agendas. This hollows out theories, most provocative insights. In one seminar, says Anahita, we were told to clean psychology, to fit our values. One guy literally said, use verses from the Quran instead of analytic terms. He said everything in our books is already covered better in Islamic texts. I thought if repression had a face, it would look like this guy, but I said nothing. So here's the distortion moves into the opposite direction. Instead of treating Freud or Lacan as a scripture, the very core of psychology is hollowed out and attacked. Homayunpur captures this paradox. She notes that psychoanalysis in Iran is sometimes mutually deemed impossible. Some Western analysts have argued that the Oedipus complex cannot apply to Iran because, quote, the symbolic order is upside down, suggesting the Iranian, basically suggesting, as she gets into it, the Iranian national psyche is psychotic. Iranian colleagues, meanwhile, either cling rigidly to imported theory or demand its purification. What gets lost is precisely what makes psychoanalysis meaningful, its ability to unsettle, to improvise, and to reveal the unconscious in locally emergent forms. This is not just an intellectual issue. It shapes the psychic lives of trainees. They learn to fear vulnerability and mistrust their thinking, their own thinking. Originality becomes dangerous. Curiosity can be punished. And I tell you, The punishment is vicious. And I'm not talking about politics anymore. I'm talking about the space, the atmosphere within these training cycles, the way they are treated by their peers or by their supervisors. I'm not even capturing any of that here, really, of what I have seen. So psychoanalysis is therefore both desired and resisted. It functions not only as a clinical method, but as a symbolic site of modernity itself, and so on. So I don't want to get into this much. This is what I mean by distorted depths. The distortion is not in the patients who tell layered stories, nor in the analysts who listen. The distortion is ideological and structural, political. It happens when psychoanalysis is treated either as untouchable scripture or a threat to be tamed by ideology. Let's look at ideology and political subjectivity. To speak about mental health in Iran without speaking about the state, not simply as an institution, but as a force that penetrates the psychic process, would be to miss, obviously, what providers must endure. Even in my own therapy, one psychotherapist said, he's in the US now, this one, by the way. Even in my own therapy, I edited myself. I'd stop mid-sentence and think, what if she repeats this to someone? What if it gets back to the hospital? Or worse, I learned not to say certain words, preemptively changed topics, not about politics, not about wanting to leave, not about religion. I told myself, Javed, you need to talk like there's always a microphone in the room. Javed is not being metaphorical. In a context where politics are criminalized and where boundaries between professional and state institutions are so porous, clinicians carry the logics of surveillance deep within themselves. Even in therapy, a space presumed to be safe, the shadow of the state is present. This is internalized surveillance, what Veena Das calls the descent of the state into the recesses of the subject. In Iran, this descent is palpable. Clinicians learn to speak cautiously, not only with patients and supervisors, but with themselves. Supervision often became a rehearsal of ideological discipline, even when it's absolutely so. So there's a good part of it that is literally and explicitly ideological. But I'm talking about the part that is not explicitly ideological, the implicit part of it. What interpretations were acceptable, what emotions marked one as deviant or disloyal. One resident described feeling the state had, quote, entered the clinic through the back door. Several patients, too, said they censored themselves, not only because of political fear, but because they weren't sure their therapists were safe. The analytic dyad in Iran is never just dyadic. And I'm not talking in Lacanian terms, you know. It is, or maybe in Lacanian terms too, you can call it that, but perhaps more dimensional than that. It is triangulated or more complicated through the state, spectral, unnamed, but deeply structuring. In the seminar, Mitra says, I brought up the rising suicide rates among young people arrested during the Mahsa uprising. That's the Woman Life Freedom a few years ago. I wanted to discuss how we might make sense of this clinically. My professor cut me off immediately. That kind of idea is dangerous here, he said. Be careful. Dangerous. In the classroom about suicide, it's dangerous to talk about suicide. Intellectual curiosity here is cast as threat before it is even articulated. The seminar becomes a zone of ideological instruction. Not everything can be questioned. Later, that professor, just so you know, apologized privately to Mitra, and to me, that underscores the duplicity of the situation, if anything. Mehdi says, my patients do it too. They stop themselves, lower their voices, look around before they continue. Even in the clinic, they talk like someone is listening in. At best, they ask if it's okay to talk about certain things. And to be honest, I wonder the same thing. You see, both of us are afraid to talk. This is the shared condition of political subjectivity. It's not about a singular ideology, it's about a way of inhabiting the world, censoring, hesitating, fearing, surviving. Therapists and patients mirror one another, trapped in a structure shaped by political fear. Patients arrive with problems that are not just psychological, but political. But to name these directly will be a political act, one that providers must navigate carefully, to say the least. The result is what China Mills calls the weaponization of mental health. Diagnostic categories used not to liberate, but to discipline. Depression is framed as individual pathology, anxiety as a personal flaw, suicidality is imbalance, never as protest, despair, or aftermath of torture, even. It's strange, Mahmoud says, hating the thing you also represent. I believe I believe in therapy, but I also know that sometimes when I name someone's depression, I am actually covering over what they really wanted to say. The thing I can't let them say, because if they do, I can't repeat it after them, and that will destroy the therapeutic bond. Just listen to this, read it again. He stops them, prevents them preemptively from going places, because if they do, then he can't follow, and that would break the, the therapeutic bond. This is, anyway. Here we see not just political subjectivity, but political dissociation. The therapist represents a system they know is broken, silencing the voices they are meant to amplify. They become both subject and agent of ideology. Psychiatry in Iran, like elsewhere, has at times been explicitly weaponized. Protesters pathologized, dissidents labeled unstable, suicide reframed as weakness, and so on. Several clinicians recall being asked to evaluate patients or even colleagues whose political activity raised concerns. One was instructed to remove politically sensitive material from a chart. Another witnessed schizophrenia diagnosis used to discredit dissidents. This is the dark mirror of global mental health discourse. The language of care mobilized to support and to suppress and silence. Clinicians are caught inside this net in Iran, sometimes resisting, sometimes complying, but most often simply trying to survive. In most cases, providers become soft arms of the state, even as they themselves suffer under it. And still, that silent burden majority shows up. They listen. They try to do what is possible in an impossible frame. Sometimes the only thing they can offer is presence, that the patient is not suffering alone. We don't heal here. We don't heal here, says Mortaza. We witness, or Mahmoud, sorry. This witnessing is not nothing. It is a part of what Veena Das calls life in the aftermath. Small, persistent acts of endurance when structures fail. But it is precarious and unsustainable. Clinicians cannot survive indefinitely as silent witnesses. Without care for themselves, they become mute instruments to the same system that they want to resist. Rahmat Khuda, God's mercy, here flows through the shared recognition of mutual repression, both patient and provider. They know what cannot be said, and sometimes that silent recognition is the most honest and most subversive thing in the room. Quickly talking a little bit about direct weaponization of psychiatry. Again, this is where one could really talk for a long time. Um, if political subjectivity shapes the everyday lives of clinicians and patients inside the clinic to form a dark mirror of global mental health, its darkest mirror yet appears in the state's overt weaponization of psychiatry. The stories of providers of shared here are not paranoid fantasies. These are daily realities unfolding in a country where psychiatry is openly used as a tool of repression, where dissidents and protesters are not only imprisoned, but routinely pathologized, drugged, and institutionalized as mad. So this is Roya Zakeri. I'm not going through details again. She was arrested in Tabriz for participating in demonstrations for women's rights, was not tried in court. Instead, she was transferred directly to Razi Psychiatric Hospital. Her family was told that she was unstable, uh, though her only symptom, quote unquote, was refusing to stop protesting. At Razi, she was medicated against her will and held in the same section as patients with chronic psychosis. Her lawyer never received documentation of psychiatric diagnosis. She was, in effect, disappeared into a psychiatric category, transformed from political subject into a clinical case. I'm just going to show quickly just a few examples, but we don't have time to wait. This is the most recent one, Kianush Sanjari. He ended up killing himself after a long history of, you know, psychiatric abuse. Akbar Laksani, Ahu Daryai. Let's stop on this. This is just from one hospital a few years ago, right? Like over a year or so. This was the list that was leaked. These are not isolated abuses. They are parts of a systemic pattern. Dissidents are labeled mentally ill, forcibly hospitalized, and treated not as political actors, but pathological cases. At times, the violence is spectacular. Injections, electroconvulsive therapy, forced sedation, but at other times, much more often, it is banal, like a court ruling declaring a hijab protester psychologically unwell. And these are some famous cases, but this has happened a lot. And ordering her to rehabilitation. They have, in fact, now centers for rehabilitation, psychiatric and mental health center for women who don't, cover themselves with the hijab, I mean the hair. So I'm not talking about going out naked. To rehabilitation. This is not psychiatry mobilized to heal, not even to discipline, but simply to punish. Or to go back to China Mill's language, this form of weaponization of mental health is not even what she terms violence with a civilizing mission. This is violence with a terrorizing mission. One psychiatrist who could no longer tolerate and left the country despite her wishes, she tells me, see if I have it here. No, I don't. I don't have it here. They wanted me to write that a prisoner was paranoid, that this talk of surveillance was delusion, but I couldn't. I knew she was being watched. I knew I was being watched too. So here I had some conversation I'm just going to leave out. Something fascinating about this shift, like I said, this switching to using psychiatric language much more directly rather than religious and moral and so on, has really risen in the last, let's say, decade, half a decade mostly. And that says something I think very significant about the nature of the regime and change. But I'm not going to get into that. So let's come to where are we now? 11 o'clock. Okay, so I have a little bit more time. Shame, survival, and diasporic haunting. If training injures the self and ideology distorts the frame, then the residue left behind in the clinicians is often a quiet, even unconscious, but corrosive shame. A shame that is not dramatic, not spoken, but runs deep. It lives in the body, in fatigue, in hesitation, in the things not asked and the things not answered, and in the rising tides of suicides and substance addictions among psychiatrists and others. As one psychiatrist student put it, I was scared you would think I was fragile, talking to me, or unprofessional, or just not serious. I know that sounds ridiculous. You're my therapist, but it's like there's this version of myself that I have to protect, the good doctor version. If she cracks, I don't know what's left. So, shame here is not a sudden emotion, it is a structural. It's the inevitable byproduct of being trained into silence, of living in contradiction, of trying to hold others, and so on. The internal version of the good doctor becomes an armor. But like all armor, it isolates, it's heavy, and it has a toll. It makes intimacy dangerous even in therapy. Another clinician put it more bluntly: I still feel like I did something wrong. Last night I couldn't sleep. She was referring to an incident that objectively wasn't her fault at all, a clinical miscommunication. Uh, it was guilt, an ongoing sense of failure that she carried into every session with her, and even others' failures easily triggered it. This is what moral injury looks like in the clinical world. Not just the trauma of what is witnessed, but the shame of surviving within the system that makes empathy costly and care impossible. It is the feeling of becoming complicit in harm, even when your intentions were good, even when you were not directly involved in any infliction of harm. And it often persists long after the clinician leaves the institution, even the country. Which brings me to the question of diasporic haunting. One of the clinicians I've quoted is among those who now live and work abroad. She is respected, effective, and outwardly confident. But the legacy of her training in Iran, the sexual exploitation by her analyst, the brutal institutional complicity, the culture of silence in reaction to all of that, still shadows her clinical work. I don't work here anymore, she says, but I carry it with me. The training, the shame, the doubt. It's like it's stitched into how I listen. Even now, when I'm sitting with a patient here, that's in the US, part of me is still wondering, am I allowed to say that? Am I allowed to feel that? This is the psychological residue of a repressive system where abuse serves almost as a sort of currency, and the rules of silence are so deeply internalized that they persist even when the external threat is gone. But something else lives on too, a kind of stubborn commitment, a refusal to abandon the work, even if the frame is cracked, and a deep sense of the work of therapy as politically meaningful. One more clinician, this one still in Iran, says, I just keep going. I see my patients, I write reports, I supervise juniors, I function, but sometimes I feel like I'm just a scaffold, holding up something I don't believe in, and I don't know how long I can do that. So, functioning here is not evidence of health, it's evidence of adaptation. And as Behruzan has argued in Prozac Diaries, adaptation itself can become an idiom of suffering, a way of surviving without ever fully recovering. Her notion of generational bind, where historical trauma is metabolized um, through psychiatric vernaculars like depression may be extended here. These clinicians aren't just surviving individually, they're carrying the memory of a broader collapse, a war, a revolution, the long aftermath of silencing and dark shadows. Many of these clinicians also go uh, to the so-called Khamushi, belong rather to the Khamushi or the silenced generation, as Fisher and Behruzan uh, told us. Those who grew up in dark basements during air raids, surrounded by the aesthetics of death and sacrifice, and who now carry the unresolved trauma of a nation that never properly mourned. And yet, in that collapse, something continues to flicker. A desire to make the clinic mean something to someone, to make the frame real, even if it was once used against them. Maybe I can't be a perfect therapist, but I can at least not become the thing that hurts me, says Roshan. All right, so let me come to the ending section as fragile solidarity and the moral project of care. Let me return one last time to what I started with. Geda be geda, rahmat Khuda. From one beggar to another, God's mercy. Even if you're not Iranian, at the first glance, it may sound, like a statement of resignation. Two people in need, neither of them able to offer real help, a shared poverty that cancels itself out. But as I've listened to clinicians in Iran in their stories of training, of harm, of silence and survival and resilience, I've come to hear this proverb differently. What if this is not just a lament? What if it's a truth about care, albeit an uncomfortable truth not many want to admit? In Iran today, the clinic is not really a sanctuary. It is a site where two forms of precarity meet: the patient, who arrives with unnameable pain, like I said before, and the provider, who sits with them, equally burdened, equally uncontained, with their own unnamed pain. The clinician is not an outsider to the social forces that shape the patient's despair. She is inside them too, trained in silence, shaped by censorship, policed by gendered expectations, and often carrying shame that has nowhere else to go. Throughout this talk, I've tried to show that the problem with mental health care in Iran is not simply a lack of resources, nor a mismatch between Western models and Iranian culture. The resonance is there. Psychoanalysis, depth psychology, like I said, they all fit. But the institutions built around them distort and allow out their potential. They are designed and built to do so. The training systems teach dissociation as professionalism. The ideological landscape rewards sedimented fear over agile curiosity. And the clinicians themselves, so often imagined as stable providers of care, they are trained into a most precarious kind of psychic fragmentation. And yet, like I said, they keep going. And here's the point for me: they listen, they supervise, they try to hold their patients' sorrow, even as they can't speak their own. They smile through headaches, they cry in bathroom stalls, they make clinical notes while doubting the legitimacy of every diagnosis they've been taught. What does it mean to be a provider under these conditions? It means becoming a kind of ethical improviser, someone who tries to do good work from inside a broken frame, someone who cannot speak freely but still manages to make space for others to speak, or tries, someone who, despite being denied containment, still offers it. To be sure, this is not health, but it is care. And perhaps in this moment in the country's life, care is more urgent than health. When we think global mental health, we tend to default to a kind of deficit model, a list of what's missing, what's failed, what needs to be given, and what needs to be built. But my talk here does not arrive at any of that. My talk says we need to listen closely to what exists, even in the fragmented form, that we take seriously the experience of the clinician as a subject of suffering, not just as provider of services, nor even just a witness of suffering. That we read institutional failure not only as dysfunction or a manifestation of deficiencies and losses, but as a living field of human horizons and moral struggles. If, as Behruzan and Fisher tell us, psychiatric and mental health language has become part of generational memory in Iran, shaping how distress is named and felt, I want to suggest that clinician subjectivity is part of that memory as well. The psychiatrists and analysts I've worked with are not immune to the conditions that they're treating, and they are its inheritors, its vessels, its witnesses. And again, if Behruzan and Fisher's haunting words, I'm quoting, this is not a nation that forgets, but a nation that cannot find where to place its memories. The clinic, the mental health space, has become one such place, however fragile, haunted, or precarious. And if Humayunpur reminds us, as Humayunpur reminds us, psychoanalysis in Tehran survives not through purity, but through improvisation, then perhaps that's where we should look. Not for so-called success stories, but for the acts, the small acts of adaptation, resistance, and co-endurance that keep the practice alive, even if distorted. And here we are again, back to the two beggars story. Can we not, in fact, should we not take this encounter as a form of ethical relation in the mental health clinic in Iran today? One beggar cannot fix the other, but they can sit together, be together, and refuse the fantasy of mastery or slavery together. In a system that demands silence, this shared presence is already a faint but defiant voice. So, in some sense, this is a talk about what happens when healing is not available and care still continues when training is a wound and practice a moral improvisation. I talk about how the clinic becomes a place not of solutions, but of fragile yet liberatory solidarity. And maybe that is its own kind of mercy. Thank you.
So thank you, Sadiq.
Wow.
I think we're
Wow. Good.
we're left
How
speechless in a way. And and
extraordinary.
thank you for simply making, for witnessing to us about this situation. I think it's different than when Mary Jo and I were there many years ago. It is something that at one level is recognizable, but at another level is beyond, in a certain way beyond imagination. And so I think um, just to say thank you for, in a way, a very beautiful presentation of something that is hardly bearable.
Thank you, Mark.
So, Orchidea,
Yeah, go ahead.
which do you want to do? I'm completely up to you guys. I wasn't part of the planning. Michael, you go first or Orchidea?
Um, I think Workaday should be the primary respondent. Um, yeah, go ahead, Workaday.
Uh, I'm going خواب دیده. I'm the mute dreamer at this point because it first of all it just reminded me why I like you and your work so much, because I think I mean, a lot of people in this room agree with me that there is something that makes your work special is the person you are, the sensibilities you have, the way you care and your interpretive humility, but also genius, but all of that with such tact and care. And I think aside from that, this is such an important piece of work because this is something that's been underattended. At some points, I cried. I listened with different ears because I think I hear this talk on the one hand as the Prozac Diaries person, and how this in a way completes that incomplete work. And on the other hand, I listen and I'm back to medical school, and I'm back to the you talked about fragility and helplessness. And so I think I kind of switch hats in my comments that are extremely raw. I just made some notes as you were talking, but please forgive me because I think this is just for me also. By saying what I'm thinking, I'm hoping to make sense of what I'm thinking. So first of all, thank you for that, Sadek. Ironically, recently I was listening to parts of this audiobook. Stephen Grosh has this famous book, Examined Life and Loves Labor, and he's a psychoanalyst who talks about his practice. And he's a very good storyteller. And sometimes when I listen to that, I listen to it as an audiobook. Sometimes with works like that, I feel a sense of irritation because I feel like what a pristine, easy landscape to work in. It's a very unfair comment, but the privilege of just dealing with the patient's unconscious jumps at me in those kinds of accounts. And so you also reminded me of that. And I think what you're talking about, in a way, I can divide it into two things. One is this outer life of psychiatry, the political life of psychiatry, in the way that it's become a tool for political oppression, for terrorizing. I think terrorizing is the best way to capture it. And it goes, and it's only gotten more graphic and intentionally scary. In Prozac Diaries, I talk about a war veteran who puts himself on fire in front of the parliament, and the next day the head of the parliament comes out and says he was a junkie schizophrenic. That language has now changed, and now you don't need to put yourself on fire or be called a schizophrenic junkie. All you have to do is to protest, be in a and then you end up like Kavuse the Mami, medicated, forced to suicide, or Kianush Sanjari, which is one of the most painful recent stories. So that outer life, I think you've just said such important things about. I don't have anything to add to that. Then there's the inner life of the clinical encounter, which has so many layers, and the way you're talking about it and you're showing us how it's oversaturated with political subjectivity. And there's no escape, there's no room to breathe. There's so much politics in the room, you can't breathe. And in a way, it's the force and this oversaturation of this political subjectivity and forced political dissociation that you described that forces people into a psychiatric subjectivity. Maybe that's one of the languages that clinicians are finding also to use. But when you talk about the silencings was the most interesting and resonant for me. Training, you said, as psychic violence. And I had a couple of thoughts about that. There is something about medical training in general that, the way you have to be to separate yourself from the patient, how much you get involved. And in one of my the first ever patient I had as an intern was a woman who at the time was 29 and I was 22 and I thought she was very old. She had cancer and I basically got very attached to her, and she had a very painful journey, not because of cancer, but also because of what happened to her in life. And I remember towards the end, one of the days that she was in her last days, I kept going to see her. I was long done with that rotation, but I kept going to see her. And I came outside of the room. They were sending her to hospice. I came outside the room and I kind of choked. And we had a professor, an oncology professor, who happened to know me outside of, as in like I had published, I don't know, a poem or something somewhere. He knew that. He came outside the room and tapped my shoulder and said, "My daughter, you have to choose. You have to be either a doctor or a poet." And I think the way he made me feel like stupid, and the idea was that you shouldn't feel this much, you shouldn't feel, and this is part of the training. So that there's that silencing. Then there is the silencing within the world of psychiatry and psychoanalysis and the cult of personalities. And Sadak can tell you more about all these fights between the Association of Psychoanalysts and the camp that's, the sanity camp, all of those things impact training because it creates a policed space that you have to decide allegiances. And then there is the story of psychoanalysis coming into clinical practice by psychiatrists. So you have talked to psychologists, psychoanalysts, and psychiatrists, which gives us a very interesting broad view. I only know about psychiatrists, and the way psychiatry was so, from the day one after the revolution, psychiatry was politicized and censored. We couldn't mention Freud's name. And then the fight that I talk about in the book, how people like Sanati brought or tried to bring psychoanalysis in a sanitized way, kind of simplified it, but they brought it into psychiatric training. And they considered it a massive achievement because they wanted to legitimize psychoanalysis. Otherwise, even psychiatrists were looking down on psycho. So this politics, this internal politics, I'm wondering how it affects psychoanalysis being understood as a politicized enterprise, how it affects the silencing. And then there's also an ignorant side from the medical side. I do have interviews with clinicians who were like, "Oh, Freud, that guy who talked about sex, that's something I was told by in fact, actually neuroscientists who were former physicians." So the way these ways of knowing are managed or policed or allowed or banned, I'm so curious to know how you think that changes this silence that intersects with this political subjectivity, because there's the political subjectivity and then there's the political subjectivity within these spaces. So I'm curious about that. And then as you were talking about what they can and cannot tell, I couldn't help thinking back to my own experiences with Iranian versus non-Iranian therapists. And, some of our experiences are so difficult to translate into English. And yet I found myself only able to work with an American psychoanalyst because my experience with my Iranian psychiatrist, who was also psychoanalytic, was that I couldn't say a lot of things. And I don't know why. I mean, I was here. I wasn't in Iran. This is like recent years, but there's something even in the language that has made it impossible. And not that doctor necessarily would be connected to the regime or anything, but there is something about the impossibility of doing any of this in Persian without in that safe way. And I resent that because I think that's what they've done to the language, even with all of this. And of course, I think as a woman, that has a whole other dimension that has been talked about by others. And then there's this mirroring that you were talking about, a mirroring of precarity between these two people, that these two actors, the mirroring of helplessness, the mirroring of fragility, solidarity. When I was always struggling with how to articulate this, and I think you just solved that problem. When I submitted my manuscript to Stanford, the editor suggested that I take out the 2 chapters on psychiatry. She said, this is a book about this generation. This is a book about the 80s and Iran. And suddenly you talk about the history of psychiatry and talk about Druzhba Hospital. And I didn't have the right words to, I fought back. And that's why the book is weird, because it has these 2 chapters that, but my argument was that I can't separate the doctors. These doctors are also talking about their generational memories. These doctors are, but I was very under-equipped to articulate that. And I think you did such a beautiful job of bringing this argument to life that, what in Iran is now called the tsunami of suicides among residents. And it's not just psychiatrists. In cardiology, in orthopedic surgery, most of us know by 3 or 4 degree of separation some resident who had committed suicide recently in the past recent, I don't know, since COVID, I say. Then there is the brain drain. There is a shortage of certain specialties in Iran. Right now, there's concern that pediatrics cardiology is losing its residents, that we don't have anyone in major cities. So there is also that there's this doomed state of not just being under all of this, but also seeing others leaving, and that's what that does to you as someone who's staying. And then I can't help thinking about the specific generational location of these people, as you said, because they are, and it makes me wonder about 2 things. One is what listening evokes in them in relation to their own unmourned losses, in relation to what they probably, and then I'm wondering, can they in supervision deal with any of that? It's probably like a vicious cycle, like a loop. They can't, but how far does that go? Is there a generational element there? Or if their supervisors are, I don't know, above 75, does that make a difference? If they're supervised, and how does that will change generationally, because this silence is getting more consolidated. And so, yeah, these are really unformed thoughts. I'm just wondering. And then finally, I think there is something that was extremely resonant with what I'm trying to think about these days, in relation to the moral collapse. And you talked about moral injury. And in what I'm writing right now, I'm thinking about this this replacement of, if there was a time that people were talking about depression all the time, today they're talking about death. They're talking about, this is like living death. This is, every day is death. Every day is war. There is something about decay. And in that decay, they specifically use a term, keramat insani. There is an assault on human dignity. And I think what you were saying, it brought that for me also a bit closer, that there is something about a collapse in the moral fiber of everything. And there is another proverb that also came to my mind. which is what when it's actually it doesn't translate well, and I'm not going to say it. I'm just saying it in Farsi because Sadek knows what I'm talking about. It's like "Kuri bebin ke asla keshe kure degar shavad." It's like one blind person trying to help the other blind person pass the street, and that's there's how much do you have to, and I think that's um you articulated so beautifully this scene to describe what it means to be uncontained. I mean, all of these things, yes, there is a scene with all of this moral injury and with all of this damage, injuries, but I think the precarity and sense of unsafety of where do I fall, what happens after the collapse is an additional layer, which is because people are, there is nowhere to contain you. There's nothing to hold you. And then I'm thinking about the embodied aspect of that, the fatigue, the burnout, the tsunami of cancer in young residents, the tsunami, and tsunami is a word that in Farsi is used as tsunami of overdose, tsunami of heart attacks, and why it's happening in people under 50. I think you just showed us why. I'm going to stop there, but I just want to thank you for, I mean, for beautifully articulating a lot of things that were so embodied, and I didn't have any words to even think with about them. And you just gave us beautiful words for them. And I also want to thank you for doing this work because it's so extremely important. It's almost urgent. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you, Orkide. I don't really know what to say. These are wonderful points. Thank you so much for, your beautiful kind of reaction and description of what I said. And I know you get it because you've been doing this, you've been looking at all this, so deeply, so closely. And you also come from that context. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. This is not trying to be poetic or nostalgic or political or any of that. This is just me, like I said at the beginning, just reporting what I've seen, and it's heavy. It's hard. And like you said, one of my major problems is nobody seems to be saying it. Even as I, wrote this and I came here to say it, I felt like, is that okay that I'm doing this? There is almost like a sense of it's just so ugly that nobody really dares say what's happening right now and how deep it goes and how bad it is. Those who are living in it, they have an interest in not seeing it because I don't know how you can survive if you see it and know that you're in it and that's all you have to do.
Can I
That
just
I
say
understand.
something to that? I'm so sorry to interrupt you because I'm thinking it's also it's not that like this is happening to engineers. There is something about this happening to clinicians because they're the last resource. Like they're their last resort. They are the last hope. And I think it's the fall of the hope of hopes,
Yeah,
which is, because the clergy is no longer that.
yeah,
Doctors
right.
are, clinicians are, yeah.
That's where people are supposed to go with their sufferings, right? To feel better, to get healed, to deal with it, to find a space. So the clinician, I guess one thing we learn as clinicians is to how to carve that space, you know. And I'm talking about a situation that even has become impossible. Like last resource, can't do it anymore. It's really gone. Kafkir is really a tahdig. There is nothing left. There's literally nothing left. The only thing that was left was perhaps this discursive claim of the Islamic Republic to ethics, to morality, to religion, to God, and so on. And for various reasons, what you're describing right now, what you just told us about this tsunami and so on, is because that is falling apart as well. That has fallen apart as well, both internally, which is the parts that I really couldn't get into, because it just needs more thinking and developing. You know, the switching to the psychiatric modality in some sense really resonates with Foucault's idea, right? This transformation from pastoral to blah blah. But there is something so much uglier in it, so much more frightening than, that beautiful story of Foucault. Now think about it. For me to be able to call Foucault's story beautiful, that just tells you how ugly I see when I look at what is happening right now. Okay, it's like death itself coming out and talking to you now, instead of the priest that being replaced by psychiatrists and so on. Now you just have the Grim Reaper itself coming speaking to you, um, and taking charge of things. That's what is happening in that country, and like I said, there was this imagined fantasy of the state having at least this word somehow, even though nobody saw it, but they have some connection to God. And that was good for a lot of people. Somehow they counted on that. Like, yeah, in their central bank, there is gold. There's God gold in there somewhere. Yeah, we've never seen it. Nobody has seen it. Doesn't make any sense, but it is there. They say there is there, and I'm going to say it's there. Okay. But now they can't even say that. And that's where things are really dangerous, because there's nothing now. Like you said, you're saying how far it goes. It's just turtles all the way down. Okay. There's nothing. It's gone, and people know it's gone. So even that imaginary thing that they were able to, that they can't do it anymore. Nobody. These patients, the clinicians, nobody. And then with the more concrete situations like Israel attacking and so on, even that discourse of power, now it's gone. Right? So there's this emperor who is not emperor, who has nothing to do with God. God is not backing it, and doesn't have even clothes on. So and it's just it's a mess. It's a mess, and I don't see anything good. I know you said a lot of wonderful and important things, and here my mind went in a different direction. But that's about all I can say right now. And I really appreciate the feedback, Orchid. Really, really, this for me, given your expertise, your work, your knowledge, and so on, just to hear this reaction from you is very meaningful. And I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't know that I should or can respond in the sense that I'm a degree of an outsider, despite having seen a lot of this when I was in Iran and experiencing it through working so closely with Orchidea over many years, and Mehdi Abadi and Maziar Latfalian, and of course Sadegh, many. But I'm always looking for hope and mercy, right? So mercy, that term actually kept taking on layers of meaning for me. Um, I wrote something out in immediate reaction to reading the draft of the paper. Um, and I'm not sure if you have changed much of the paper, but I was intrigued by the arc of the paper and particularly the ending of the paper as you read it out. I must say, Sadegh, the way you read the paper, and Orchiday's already said this. I mean, it was so powerful and poetic, not in the sense people have said in the chat, beautifully written and all of that. Here's what I wrote before, and let me, I'm not going to read everything that I wrote, but just the way it started, which is psychoanalysis, psychotherapies of all sorts, and Sadek Rahimi, Mercy, um, as a practitioner, are storytellers and poets, Orchidea, and poets. Poets in the finest sense, able to catch onto truths, the truths in passing, the ephemeral truths, contextualize their profundity, and so do what I think of as the task of also good ethnography, which has both an aesthetic and ethical dimension. Sadek's interlocutors are often the most eloquent of poets, and we need to attend with care, again, the word with which you end, and where possible, with support and solidarity. For me, the real sparkle in Sadek's paper, one of the real sparkles, that was last night, tonight, today, I'd say there are multiple sorts of these sparkles, profound sparkles. In Sadek's paper are the eloquent case materials about who is repressed. And he begins with 4 shocking cases. And let me remind, those 4 cases are repression of union leaders, repression of women, repression of the mystical sects in Iran that, well, I'll ask a question about that later, but that give so much of the cultural identity to Iranian poetry. Um, for me, the real sparkle in Sadek's paper are the eloquent case materials about who is repressed, and he begins with those 4 shocking cases. The quotations he gets from the psychiatry residents, the double binds that young therapists are caught within, and the atmosphere in the psychiatry seminars, including, as he stressed, the apology by a professor after the class outside the hospital for shutting down a question about suicides. Um, there are a lot of comments that I could make, but I actually am more interested now in hearing the reactions of those who have experience with patients, um, from our collectivity. I think we don't have much time left, so let's open it up. And you've heard, Sadek, you've heard already some of my reactions and comments on the draft script, and we can talk about that more. And I look forward to that, and perhaps in class today as well. So, do other people want to comment at this point?
Eric?
So I want the point about where you end, and my point about the poetry that comes out of this pain and the commitment to one another despite all of this. I think one can't underplay that. In Iran, one reaction to the descriptive part of what you have given us is, well, this sounds like the Soviet Union. All of these things were done there. And in a lesser extent, this is the fear that we all have of what's about to happen in the United States, right? The idea of people being snatched off the streets, just as an example from where you start. And we have used medicine in all sorts of ways as repressive tools. So to hang on to the commitment to caring for one another is not a trivial matter. It's the locus of hope, and that's why the proverb is so powerful, and you've really done extraordinary work with it. Um, but I could go on, but let me stop there and
Thank you
see
so much,
if
my doctor,
people
for
want to
that.
have reactions.
Let me just say quickly, thank you, really. You sent me some notes on that draft that I sent you last night, and I really appreciated it. Yes, I had to shorten it a lot. So even as I was reading, I left a bunch of stuff out. Um, so you're right, there are changes. Uh, but everything that you've said, I'm really looking forward to hearing more and talking to you more about that. Thank you.
Go ahead, Eric.
Thanks for a great presentation, Sadek. I've never heard you go so deeply into your work, and I just echo the previous comments about how poetic the whole thing is and how much your own sensibility comes through. Uh, and I immediately started thinking about, because I just was reading for class this week, one of the suggested readings was Paul Broadwin. And so I immediately started thinking about certainly not nowhere near as violent, but the long history of the same issue in American and English psychiatry. And some of the markers for me are Ryan's stuff in the 70s about blaming the victim and the Victorian management of women by sending them to the asylum. And then the whole anti-psychiatry movement, Thomas Sass and J.D. Lang and Cooper. And then because my own dissertation involved me learning the DSM-3, became aware of Spitzer's extremely aggressive reformulation of psychiatric diagnosis, where the ambition was to be completely about the person's symptoms, nothing else. And then Paul's beautiful descriptions of how mental health caseworkers are trained very carefully to make the idea that of course, there's some social support and money and the institutionalization and stuff. So it's a lot nicer in a way than even psychiatry in the US in previous decades, but still they're very carefully trained by their supervising psychiatrists to consider that their clients' problems are disorders of brain chemistry. That's the central thing. And they're discouraged from making anything else central. And the cure for that is medication. So, and this is very strong. I mean, part of what Spitzer did was to get psychoanalysis exiled from American psychiatry because it was too subjective. But so the same kind of thing happens, but without maybe as much physical violence. So I wonder what you think about that.
Um, I I think that's a definitely, a- that association is obviously there. The question for me is, I don't know. It's almost like, that weird analogy that I made about, you know, I talked about the Grim Reaper and so on. It's almost like seeing, like in the image that you're giving is a psychiatrist doing it, and the other one is the same act, but it's done by something so much more frightening, so much more um, simultaneously scary and uncanny. Uh, that is just very hard for me to make that. I'm sorry. I don't. I'm certainly with you. Okay. This is very directly relevant. So let me just make that very clear. But there's something else in this story of the situation in Iran that I'm having a hard time capturing and responding to try to explain why is it different, like what that difference is. And I'm afraid I'm failing to do that. I don't know how to capture it. Maybe someone can help. I don't know.
I
Orchid.
I do get that it's profoundly more violent, both
No, it's
physically.
not just violence. I mean, obviously, yes, you're right. It's profoundly more violent.
I mean, even spiritually violent.
Yeah. I mean, can I just agree with that by saying I think, Eric, what you're saying resonates in the sense that uh, they also made psychiatry extremely biological after the revolution. And there was a whole movement in academic psychiatry towards psychoanalysis in the 70s, and that was aborted with the revolution. So, this very brain-centered psychiatry was a very good sort of growing ground for what Sadek is talking about. In a way, it helped. It helped that the landscape was filled with psychiatrists who were trained very biologically in the beginning. And Sadek, I don't know if this is correct in your reading. My sense is that it would have been very different if this was happening somewhere where psychiatrists were Lacanian. It's kind of sat well in terms of training in the way medicine is taught in Iran. It's because the Holy Grail is American textbooks. The Holy Grail is Western bioethics. So objectivity, bedside manners, you don't get involved emotionally. And of course, doctors on the ground improvise and mix, things and have a situated knowledge. But the training aspires for that. So I don't know how you see that tension in your work, Sada. Is that still there?
The tension,
That there is a very quote unquote Western biological bend to the training
yeah.
before any of this happens.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And like when I talk about scripturalization,
Yeah,
that's an important part of it. That's a
yeah.
central part of it, right? So
But
to
it strikes me, Sadek, that what so one question is how much of this is about psychiatry and the medical professions separated from the society at large? My sense is what you're saying is that this really is a totalitarian system that pervades everything in
right,
thinking in the society or
yes,
prevention of thinking in the society. And there was already, I said this in my notes to you, there was already a movement in the 60s and 70s within religion to open up religion to interpretive flexibility, the whole thing about Shariati and the enthusiasm among the young people who eventually became the revolutionaries that one didn't do taqlid, one didn't do scripturalization, one didn't do remote um, um, repetitive learning, but that one thought for oneself. One didn't need the mullahs. And there's a kind of regression now with this um, mental set of discourses. And I was curious, I mean, this is just a minor point, that all the idioms of distress that you laid out were precisely the same that Byron had for anxiety in the 1970s or early 70s, mid 70s, except for the last one. And I noticed you didn't pick up on that in the talk, but I can't breathe to me is a translation problem because that's not literally what the Persian idiom says. And so that then raises the question, which is a larger one throughout the talk and the problematic of the influence of Western, the alien Western impositions in Iranian culture or Westernization or West toxification and so on and so forth. I mean, because I Can't Breathe was disseminated around the world from something that happened in the United States.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm curious. I also raised this question. Maybe I'll just say this for Orchidea. Apologies to everyone for making this kind of an internal shop talk kind of commentary. But as Orchidea knows, um, Gohar um, Homani Yun, what was her name?
Humayunpur.
Sorry? Um,
Mayunpur.
Mayapur, right? She she suggests, I mean, there's this whole discussion about the Oedipus complex and the suggestion that Iranians don't have an Oedipus complex. They have a complex, a Rustam complex, or a Sarab and Rustam complex of um, terrorization by the father and the killing of the son. Um, that um, that Gulnar says is a symbolization of modernization, and the it stands for the dilemmas of modernization in general. But I'm not so sure that that's the case. And I actually read this whole discourse as a metaphor of your own escape from Iran. And the living dead are, of course, continuous and everywhere and frightening. Um, so anyhow, I could go on, but let me
So,
just stop it
so
there.
let me just make a couple of very quick comments, but also then call on just a few people just to add some voices to this, because I suspect this resonates more widely in other settings, in particular among some of the, in particular among clinicians, but also those who live in more repressive settings. Number one. I just make note of one small thing that Orchide said, which is that people are committed to holding the system together because of their not having any sense of what could happen if it all fell apart. And the kind of terror, the number of people who have enough at stake in the system because they have decent jobs, et cetera, and holding the system together simply because of the terror of the alternative. And that the Grim Reaper is also in that part of the fantasy. Secondly, I have an undergraduate student who is studying something that seems completely different, but has I think at this moment, a particularly acute relationship to what you've said. She's a student who's studying doulas, birthing doulas in New York City, but who themselves have been immigrants and who themselves are working largely with immigrant populations, many of whom are immigrant populations in homeless shelters, et cetera, but in which, in a sense, that terror of now those who have survived it and have themselves are doulas are almost entirely persons with papers, and so they are not in the same threat, but they also can experience something that is unspeakable to both of them, and both in terms of the superiority, why didn't you do X, Y, or Z, but also in a sense of understanding something that's unspeakable for them to take on. And I think that unspeakability is something that is particularly acute today in those who are working with the most vulnerable persons who may at any moment be picked up and disappeared. And I just think there is another setting in which we might look at this. I'd just like to call on a few people, maybe whether Achille would like, whether Lou would like to say a word, whether Virginia, whether Marisa. Anyhow, would any of you also like to just reflect on the settings in which you live and work so that we get add a few more things in before we call this quits?
Can I say
Yeah, go ahead, Akita.
something? Yes. Well, thank you very much again, Sadik. I was very moved, and the way you calmly made it obvious that there's so much pain being experienced, such a heavy pain. I would like to say that maybe I agree there is probably something special about maybe Iranian culture, if I may generalize in this way, about keeping secrets, about this sharing secrets. I can give some examples I have, but that's another topic. The examples you gave, the case studies at the beginning, very much reminded me of Solzhenitsyn's work and how across cultures, how punishment is inflicted through the through medical treatments. But then I think it's so original how you approach the really focused on the medical doctors themselves and how they are in the same environment. That was very interesting for me, very perceptive, and it's a very global issue, even though we are talking of Iran. There are examples of maybe less serious issues, but even with adolescent mental health issues, how quickly people are categorized as not being normal when they do things which is not accepted by the authority. It's much more pervasive than I think than highly political situations. It's very much everywhere around us. Thank you very much.
Virginia Lou?
Hi. I'm so moving. Are you sure you wanna I speak because I start to cry? It's not so good.
Sadek, let me ask you just a specific question about the mystical sex. And Behnam Majubi and the late Dr. Ali Tabane,
Babanda.
Tabande. Why do you think that the intensity of repression against them has intensified? And is it more because of something about interpretation and flexibility of interpretation? Or is it something about the fact that they were also involved? I think one of them, I forget which one, probably Tabande, was a lawyer and a human rights lawyer. So the political and the psychiatric again come together.
You know, that's actually a very good question that I have been asking myself, and I don't have a good answer to it. There is something very puzzling for me. For one thing, there are many sects, right?
Yeah.
They don't target all of them, not in the same way. So I really don't know.
Do
I
you
would love
think,
to hear other people's thoughts.
Well,
Okay,
there's another element, which is
do you think
then
some
that,
of them
sorry, Orchidea?
some of them are better at organizing, and anything that's
yeah,
with that organizing is a threat? I think that's
right.
one interpretation that people have.
Right,
And
and they're also the largest of the
largest,
sects.
strongest
And
history,
they're
you know.
also, as I understand it, their followership is largely middle class, the
Mm.
teachers.
So that's I think
And
that's
I
a
think that's an important element as well.
yeah, I
Mm.
agree. I agree. But where they draw the line, right? Like which one is it? That I don't quite understand because I try to understand it, kind of in addition to these, like what is the problem with their thoughts, right? I may be it might be really misleading, misguided to try to understand in those terms, though. I'm not sure.
And maybe the fact that there aren't clear lines, where they draw the lines, if everyone knew that, they
Yep.
could live within it. The fact that there aren't such lines drawn
Right,
is part of the terror.
Part
right,
of the terror. I agree with that. Yeah,
very much. It
very
is
much.
needed because then otherwise, because then you're always scared. Right? You don't know what you're going to get punished for.
Let me just let Jed make a brief comment. He's had his hand up here. And then I think we have to say that people can leave. And if a few of us want to remain and hang on and continue talking, we can. Jed, pretty brief, please.
Okay, as I just wrote in the chat, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah. Okay, the more repressive, the more authoritarian the society, the more public and therapists themselves become paranoid. And paranoia causes the censor, which is a psychoanalytic term, to become too strong, blocking the possibilities of therapeutic accessing of unconscious materials. All accessing of the unconscious is being blocked in some cases by the psychiatric establishment. That pretty much sums up my comment. You could probably unpack it. I did have a couple of a few other things. I'm aware now that psychoanalysis has been thrown out of not only the psychiatry but out of sociology, and where I'm more located than anthropology. And I'm wondering whether any sociologists, or for that matter, anthropologists and people in this seminar have experienced any kinds of depth psychiatric treatment of themselves. Because I mean, I personally have. I went through between 2 and 3 years of psychoanalysis light on the couch. And I'm now informed by my childhood friend who is a psychoanalyst that he doesn't do couches anymore. And I get some of my best ideas when I'm sleep after having slept, horizontally. I mean, that's the only time I can access my unconscious. It's the only time I can access what I'm actually thinking is when I'm somehow reclining and analyzing my inner thoughts, because the media is so pervasive and so oppressive. Anyway, but I would be interested to know. I don't know whether it's possible, whether everybody here has had some kind of depth treatment, or not, or are there? You see my question, and I'll leave it at that. But I wanted to thank everybody involved in Sadek, and also Arkita. Is your book? Did you write this book, Prozac Diaries?
Yes.
Is this
Yes,
you
yes.
did? It's not available on Amazon. I checked. Not available on ABE Books.
Okay,
Anyway,
Maybe it's
like this
censored.
sorry.
I'll check.
let's,
I'll check. Maybe it's
so
censored. I
let's,
don't know. Check.
The spelling could also be like C or K.
Yeah,
any,
it's Prozac with a K. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, Prozac with the K.
right,
That's
thank you,
probably why. Yeah.
right.
Thanks. Anyway.
So thanks, Jed. I'll only answer that I lay on the couch for only 3 out of 20 years. Sadek?
Oh, you want?
No, I'm not how many years you were on the
I
couch.
see. I thought, I thought
Uh,
we'd go around now and talking
no,
about.
no. Uh, But, I think let's let you say a few words. I know we have to say to everyone, as we can see, people are leaving as they have to get ready to come to class and go on to other meetings, etc. We have the privilege of nobody coming into this room to chase us out. And so we have come to make use of that and carry this conversation on. But I'll let you respond to whatever you'd like at this moment.
Oh, well, the response really, I just want to say thank you. There was so many good things, brought up. Some of them, like Eric's question, I wish I could answer it better. The best that comes to my mind is something that Mike said later about the, the the kind of the way it's saturated. There's something about that experience of what is happening in Iran and their use of psychiatry that is different because there's this there's an old Iranian story of this guy who goes to a hammam to a public bath early in the morning, and someone tells him you shouldn't go there because there are jinns there at that time of day, and he decides to go anyway. But he goes in there, and he notices as he's going in, he sees some people walking on the street who, instead of feet, they have hooves, and that's like the sign of a jinn. They don't have feet; they have hooves. And he goes to the front desk and says, "Oh my God, I just saw some people outside. They had hooves." And the front desk says, "Oh, like this?" and brings up his foot, and he has hooves, lo and behold. He gets really frightened, runs inside, and the guy who's supposed to be cleaning you and so on, and he says, "Like this?" So anyway, this story, this notion, that's really that I think that's the frightening part in Iran, is this sense that just nobody is outside of it. Like when it's happened here, then you have people who make movies about it. If media finds something, it's a disaster. That's very different. That's a very different way of doing it than this sense that nobody can say or do anything about it. Everybody is like stuck in there. It's like sticky trap, no way out. There is something there that I can't capture. And I think that's also what I was trying to capture in my presentation in a broader general sense. But like that's why it affects me differently when I talk about the abuse of psychiatry in Iran than so you brought up uh, Akil Hanum, I think it was you talked about the Solzhenitsyn and so on. I have started to read that a number of times and I just can't go through it. I just can't. It's so hard for me to see through it, to read through it. And I realized finally it's because it's just so familiar. I can't create distance to enjoy it as a work of literature or as a story or anything. I just go right in there and I can't tolerate it. It's really hard. And I think that's what it is. That's this just there's no space. It's collapsed. There's just and I think that collapse in Eric's story, there is not that collapse. There is abuse, but there is not a collapse. But here we're talking about a collapse in many different senses of the word. Anyway, so thank you, everybody. This has been wonderful. And Orkide, you said, Gonge khab dide. I think we all feel that way, and Mike caught that years ago and brought it out for us, that notion, right? Talking about the movie and all that. But really, there's a whole nation that is kind of gone, really, what's happening. They just don't have words for it. When I managed to put a few words here, and talk about it, it just that, by the way, Mike, you said about I can't breathe. Yes, nafasam bala nemiyad.
Yeah,
Now,
it's different from yeah.
right. So,
And
yes,
it's original. It's not from the West. I think it goes way
Right.
back. Right?
Exactly.
yes.
The
So,
soul is crushed.
translated it as because of literally it means my breath doesn't come up. Now that's very different actually, because when I can't breathe in, my breath can't go down, right? Like that's like I can't take air in. This is much more vicious. You can't breathe out, right? So it's in you. You just can't breathe it out. Anyway, so yes, it's different. I don't think it's that I can't breathe that I can, but yeah, translation. Actually, all of those, right? You guys know, like all of those, when you translate them, they end up being something else. But yeah, anyway, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. I know there were very important and good points made that I didn't necessarily manage to address, but forgive me for that. It's too much for me. This hard. It's not that easy.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you. And it really was beautifully presented of a really of you know, all of us have worked in one way or another in relatively, more or less relatively um, autocratic or controlling settings where people were fearful of being openly expressive. But what you describe is something that's at such a level. And, I understand more about your own response to Iran these days through this talk than I did before. And I do think there is something about those who just for, for whatever reason, because of the terror of the alternative, continue to hold the society together. And of course, even those who say they're holding psychiatry together as a kind of scaffolding, whatever, it is also the terror of the collapse of that entire system. What would that be also? And so I think underlying it is a very, profound terror as well, that the Grim Reaper is all the way down also. So it's anyhow, thank you for telling us about what's happening at that level and with that astonishing level of intimacy that you did. And Lou,
Thank
we were all in
you.
tears throughout this.
Thank you for it, asking me to do it. Really, I had no intention of this. Like I've been living through this for a number of years, but I had no intention of writing about it or you know. But this became an amazing opening
I
for
also
me.
want to thank you, Sada, for because most of you don't know, I'm ashamed to say I had missed the email that Sada had sent me. I'm so grateful that you did chase up because it would have been such a loss for me to miss this. So thank you for including me in the conversation.
Thank you, Orchid. That was very important for me that you be there. And Mike, very much appreciate that. Thank you all.
Okay, I think we're going to call this to a close. I know
Thanks.
Sadek has to also prepare to teach, and so thank you all. And we'll see you, I guess. I don't even remember what's next week.
Byron, are you coming to class this afternoon?
I am. I am. We'll see you there.
Right, wonderful. Okay,
Mary Jo will, of course, be there.
wonderful. That's great. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.